With the new propositional outlines of the Old Testament, you can expose the flow of thought, see key literary features in a story, and illustrate the relationship between clauses. For example, in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, the narrator sets the stage for the rest of the book with a bit of background information. With logos, we can expose the different elements of this introduction using Old Testament propositional outlines. To transform the ESV Bible into a propositional flow, click the Visual Filter button in the Resource toolbar and select this option from the drop-down menu. This visual filter reformats the biblical text so that I can now see the flow of this narrative with main points and indented subpoints, distinct units of text that help me pinpoint what to preach, and labels that mark the intent of every line. The propositional outline exposes lines that indicate events, purposes, characterization, and more, all key aspects of biblical narratives. And with each propositional label, I can hover my mouse over the label and Logos defines it for me. So if you're interested in studying characters in this chapter, jump down to verse 2 to lines A through D labeled Characterization, which are lines of text used to describe someone or something. Here we're introduced to 4 characters that play major and minor roles in this story, and each name listed here tells us a bit about that person. For example, the name Elimelech means "my God is king," which may leave you wondering why a man with this name would leave the promised land and move his family to a foreign country. You'll find additional points of characterization in lines 4b and 4c, where we're introduced to Orpah and Ruth. Then in chapter 2, lines B and C, where we're introduced to Boaz, who's described as a man of worth or valor, a term later used by Boaz to describe Ruth in chapter 3, verse 11. If you want to track the movement of characters, scroll down to lines labeled Departure and Arrival. Like in line 1c, the narrator tells us that Elimelech departed from Bethlehem. Then in line 2e, we read that his family arrived in Moab. Then in verse 19, line A, we find that Naomi and Ruth departed from Moab and arrived in Bethlehem in line C. So in this short introduction, the narrator has taken us from Bethlehem to Moab and back to Bethlehem, where Naomi will once again receive God's blessing. And we were able to track this information using propositional outlines of the Old Testament. With this filter, we can also pinpoint major events in a story, like in Ruth chapter 1. Logos labels several major events like a famine in verse 1, the death of Elimelech in verse 3, the death of Mahlon and Chilion in verse 5, all of which result in Naomi being bereaved of her 2 sons and husband. So with propositional outlines of the Old Testament, we were able to highlight key literary features like characterization, track down the movement of characters, and expose key events that move the story forward. To get started using propositional outlines of the Old Testament, subscribe today.